Welcome, and thank you for joining this session in the Dibbles Professional Development Series, which will focus on using mCLASS to establish instructional groups inside the literacy block. Welcome, and thank you for joining this session in the Dibbles Professional Development Series, which will focus on using mCLASS to establish instructional small groups inside the literacy block. My name is Wendy Brooks, and I'm the K-5 Literacy Specialist for the Teaching and Learning Literacy team at the Louisiana Department of Education. Our mission is that Louisiana students will have improved literacy outcomes through high-quality instruction and interactions by an effective teacher who is supported by leaders and families. This is done through a birth through 12th grade comprehensive approach built around 4 key literacy pillars. The first pillar involves setting, monitoring, and communicating literacy goals at the district, school, teacher, and student level. The second pillar involves providing high-quality core instruction coupled with interventions and extensions that are explicit and systematic. The third pillar involves teachers and leaders being provided with ongoing professional growth opportunities. And the fourth pillar involves engaging families in their child's literacy development at all ages and stages. Before we begin our new learning, I would like to anchor us in Louisiana's education priorities. By participating in this session, we hope that you will be able to align your literacy instruction more closely with the science of reading, thus increasing your effectiveness as a classroom teacher. So how do we ensure that our literacy initiatives will lead to improved student outcomes? We must plan for an approach that includes 3 core areas as demonstrated in this formula. Effective practices. We should ensure that those effective practices are grounded in evidence-based research and practices that are teachable, learnable, doable, and accessible in practice. Effective implementation. Consider the stages of implementation along with implementation drivers, which considers the competency of the school staff, the needed organization or procedures within the school system, and ensuring fidelity. Enabling context. This involves considering the implementation team, which are groups of people working toward the same goal and mission through an improvement cycle. Effective practices times effective implementation times enabling context will equal improved student outcomes. The outcomes for this session are for participants being able to identify how to use mCLASS literacy screener data to establish instructional groups and practice forming instructional small groups based on literacy screener data. Once your screener data has been gathered, we would have a wealth of information about our students at our fingertips. Now that you have all of this data, what will you actually do with it? This leads us to our essential question for this session. How can classroom teachers utilize classroom literacy screener data provided by mCLASS to establish instructional small groups that are responsive, timely, and inclusive? As you proceed with this session, please be sure to use the provided note catcher to record your learning. What is the purpose of the literacy screener, and why is it important? Teachers should know that Louisiana state law requires that all students in grades K through 3 be screened by a single statewide screener within the first 30 days of school, in December, and in April. The screener serves as an indicator of whether core instruction is meeting the needs of the majority of students and can also be used to identify which students may be at risk for experiencing reading difficulties so that teachers can provide timely and effective support. The literacy screener also assists in identifying students for further evaluation for specific programming, including students who display characteristics of being dyslexic or gifted. For the purposes of clarity, it helps to know that Amplify is the publisher chosen by the state to provide access to the literacy screener, and mCLASS is the name of Amplify's digital version of the screener. The literacy screener tool is Dibble's 8th. Now let's connect what we know about the literacy screener to the science of reading. We know that there are two main sides or sections of the reading rope: the language comprehension side and the word recognition side. However, within those two main components, we must take into account the strands that are interwoven into skilled reading. A model that is based on the simple view of reading is actually highly complex. Which literacy skills are assessed through the K-3 literacy screener? Our literacy screener will provide insight into the word recognition strands: phonological awareness, decoding, and sight recognition. The following chart demonstrates the indicators that are assessed by the literacy screening in grades K through 3 at the beginning, middle, and end of each school year. In order to predict which students may be at risk for experiencing reading difficulties, indicators are used to highlight potential areas of support. Kindergarten and first grade assess letter naming, phoneme segmentation fluency, nonsense word fluency, and word reading fluency. Letter naming and phoneme segmentation fluency are last assessed at the end of first grade. Oral reading fluency is added at the beginning of first grade as an additional screener measure, along with maze at the beginning of second grade. Review those indicators and how they change across the grade levels. Pause the video if needed. Let's review what we know so far about using instructional data to make decisions inside of small group instruction. We know that universal screening is mandatory at K-3 schools. It may not always be clear, though, how the core curriculum addresses the skills assessed in the screener. Classroom teachers need support using mCLASS literacy screener data to establish instructional small groups to meet the needs of all students. What does the research say about small group instruction? The Institute for Educational Sciences, or IES, through What Works Clearinghouse, published a guide offering 5 specific recommendations to help educators identify struggling readers and implement evidence-based strategies to promote their reading achievement. Classroom teachers can use these strategies to adjust instruction to meet the needs of struggling readers and monitor their progress. These recommendations highlight the importance of taking action once we have identified students who may be at risk for falling below proficiency. Let's take a look at the first and second research-based recommendations from the IES guide. Recommendation 1, screen all students for potential reading problems at the beginning of the year and again in the middle of the year. Recommendation 2, provide time for differentiated reading instruction for all students based on assessments of students' current reading level. Let's briefly review some of the best practices for small group instruction that have been presented in previous sessions that are available on the Literacy Library. Effective small group instruction targets skills not mastered during core instruction by grouping students with similar instructional needs and providing efficient, targeted support. Hattie's effect sizes demonstrate an effect size of 0.47 for small group learning and have significant potential to accelerate student learning. So we know small groups work. For small group instruction to be effective, a systematic approach to collecting formative data on student learning is essential. Small group instruction should be responsive, timely, and inclusive. Instructional groups should be small, consisting of only 4 to 6 students per group. Instructional groups should be flexible and should be adjusted or changed in response to formative assessment data and student needs. More information about small group instruction can be accessed within the Louisiana Literacy Library with the K2 Teacher PD series, small groups. How does mCLASS recommend instructional small groups? When you log into your mCLASS account, you will be able to view your class summary. The class summary provides a broad view of the areas of strength and needed support for a whole group of students. The summary should serve as a starting point for instructional decision-making. For example, I can see that there are 15 students in this first grade class. By looking at the column for the composite score, I can see that a combined 47% of the students are performing below or well below benchmark. The remaining columns indicate performance percentages for students across the individual DIBELS indicators. For this first grade class, we see indicators for phonemic awareness, letter sounds, decoding, word reading, and reading fluency. Once we have benchmark data for the class of students, we can then access the mCLASS recommendations for instructional grouping. Amplify mCLASS does the heavy lifting of data analysis by using an algorithm that automatically forms small groups of 4 to 6 students who share the same instructional focus. The mCLASS algorithm draws on the most current benchmark and progress monitoring data for each student to automatically generate recommended groups of students. This feature supports teachers with forming flexible grouping in a responsive, timely, and inclusive manner for the purpose of delivering small group instruction. The mCLASS algorithm automatically generates these groups of students according to the latest available assessment data. The observed patterns of the students are going to be noted for each group. Let's take a look at some examples of group recommendations. How can we use, or how can I use mCLASS to establish instructional small groups in my classroom? Again, we're going to look at some examples of recommended instructional grouping based on the sample class data. Students are grouped according to observable response patterns and areas of need based on the most recent literacy screener data. Each recommended group will include the following information: the group number, as well as the focus and number of students, the names of the students, the skills that students can do, and the skills that students need to work on. For example, this group needs to focus on phonemic awareness, and there are 2 students identified, Samir and Leah. Samir and Leah can segment some word parts. However, both students need to work on identifying first, middle, and last sounds in words with 3 or more phonemes, and they need to continue building fluency in phoneme segmentation. This recommended group of students can segment some word parts. However, their response patterns showed that they struggled with identifying the initial, middle, and final phonemes in words with 3 or more sounds. So once again, group 1 has 4 students focusing on phonemic awareness. The names of the students are Hadiah, Jody, Brendan, and Colin. mCLASS has identified what the students can do according to their observed behaviors. And mCLASS also identifies what these students need to work on according to the observed response patterns. Let's look at an example for group 2. How many students are in this recommended group? What can these students do well according to the screener data? Pause the video if needed. We can see that group 2 consists of 3 students, Sheldon, Kinsley, and Micah, And all three of these students can blend their sounds into CVC words as whole words, but not consistently. With which skills does this group of students need to work on according to the screener data? These three students need to work on specific letter sounds and on reading whole words fluently. Let's look at group 3. What is the recommended instructional focus for this group, and how many students are in this group, and what are their names? Pause the video if needed. What can these students do well according to the literacy screener data? With which skills does this group of student need to work on according to the literacy screener data? And what does this assessment data indicate about the core instruction in this classroom? Now that we've looked at some examples of recommended groupings from mCLASS, remember that as the teacher progress monitors, they can click Update Recommendations for students to be regrouped as needed. Intervention or small groupings should be intentional and flexible. And progress monitoring should reflect the effectiveness of the instruction being provided within small groups. How can I prepare for implementing instructional small groups inside of my literacy block? Remember, please be sure to use your note catcher to capture your learning and your thinking. Preparing a welcoming, organized space for small groups to meet is extremely important when implementing instructional small groups. Some considerations for preparing the classroom for small group instruction may include: create a designated space for conducting small group instruction, organize mCLASS instructional materials for easy access, create a system to display and identify members of each small group that can be easily changed and adjusted, establish routines and procedures for small group instruction, establish routines and procedures for progress monitoring. So how can we establish a space for small group instruction? These are just a few ways that teachers have established a space for small group instruction. Be sure to visit the classrooms of experienced teachers and seek out innovative ideas from colleagues. The key is to work with what you already have and find the right fit for you and your classroom. Regardless of what this may look like for you in your classroom, be sure to designate a space with seating for meeting with your groups. This might be a small table or desks grouped together. Be sure to store extra materials in labeled bins, tubs, drawers, and so on. Organizing mCLASS resources for small group instruction is also important to the success of the implementation of your small groups. Your printed mCLASS instructional activities and materials can be stored in a binder. You may choose to organize by each screener measure or by each group for quick access. Store any additional manipulatives and supplies that you already have in a way that is easily accessible for teachers and students. Being able to quickly and easily access materials during small group instruction is important for both the teacher and the students. Some suggested materials for small group instruction to have on hand during small group meetings may include decodable text, magnetic letters, storage for letters, dry erase boards, dry erase markers, chart paper, handwriting paper, writing journals, and multisensory manipulatives. If you are just getting started with small groups, please do not feel as though you have to have all of these materials from the beginning. Start with what you have and work with your school leaders to build on your resources over time. Now let's consider how we would manage flexible instructional groups within the literacy block. Create a system to identify members of each small group that can be easily adjusted. Change the display often to reflect the most current mCLASS data. Make sure the system is visible and easy to use for students and for you. You might use a pocket chart, anchor chart, or other visual to display each group and a list of students for each group. The first 6 weeks of school is the perfect time to set classroom expectations and establish instructional routines for whole group, small group, and independent work time. Be sure to plan ahead and explicitly establish how students will move within the classroom, how they will access materials, and even how they will interact with other students. You'll want to think through all the moments in your literacy block and how you want that to look inside of your classroom. Remember to include routines for whole group as well, because if your entire literacy block runs smoothly, you will have sufficient time for small group instruction. Establishing routines and procedures for small group instruction will help foster an environment where students are actively learning throughout your literacy block, including during your small group instruction time. Some examples of routines and procedures to implement during the first 6 weeks of school to ensure effective and efficient small group instruction are what to bring to small group meetings, how to come to the small group table or meeting space, how to return to their seats after small group, how to gather and return small group materials, how to turn and talk with a partner, and how to come to attention. Even after establishing these routines and procedures at the start of the school year, please keep in mind you'll still probably need to revisit these following extended breaks and holidays. Some additional considerations for students working independently may include provide opportunities for meaningful and engaging independent activities that are connected to the core curriculum and grade level standards, organize materials for independent work or literacy stations in a way that is student-friendly, establish expectations for an acceptable volume level during small group instruction, establish expectations for transitioning between independent activities. Again, establishing routines and procedures for small group instruction as well as the rest of your class should also include expectations for students who are working independently during your small group meeting times. It is also important that you establish routines and procedures for your progress monitoring. Use the small group instruction plan from mCLASS to map out progress monitoring cycles. We will examine this plan in future sessions. Establish a system for organizing your progress monitoring materials. Determine the frequency of progress monitoring based on the needs of each group, and establish a system for tracking progress monitoring of each student. Again, we will explore these topics in future sessions. Closing and next steps. Teachers should utilize mCLASS grouping recommendations to establish flexible instructional groups based on the most current assessment data. Teachers should regularly update the mCLASS grouping recommendations to reflect the most recent progress monitoring data. Teachers should use mCLASS to identify observed student response patterns demonstrated by the literacy screener data. And teachers should prepare the classroom for flexible instructional groups, including organizing space and materials and establishing routines and procedures. Some next steps to consider for implementing your learning and assessing the impact would be to reflect on your previous experience with implementing instructional small groups. Consider the process for using mCLASS to establish instructional small groups inside of the literacy block. How will you use mCLASS to establish instructional small groups? How will you allow for flexible grouping in response to formative assessment data? What resources will you need to implement or improve your own small group instruction? Please be sure to use these resources for additional support on the literacy screener and goal setting, the literacy landing page, literacy library, LIFT, DIBELS, and setting and monitoring literacy goals. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please contact us at louisianaliteracy@la.gov. Thank you for joining this session in the DIBELS Assessment Series.